I will now call the meeting to order. I am Bob Megna, State Budget Director, and the Governor has designated me to chair today's meeting. I would like to note a few things, and folks that are here with us: Jeremy John, Observer for the Senate Minority Leader James Sampson; Norman DeWitowitz, Observer for Assembly Speaker Sheldon Silver; Jay Lifton, Observer for Assembly Minority Leader Brian Kolb; and Chris Columbia, Observer for City Council Minority Leader James Odom. And they're here today. I will now entertain a motion to approve the minutes of the last annual board meeting, which was held on July 28, 2010. These minutes were previously distributed for comment. Do I have a motion to accept the minutes?
So moved.
Do I have a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? We'll accept the minutes. The next item on the agenda is a review of the city's financial plan, and I would ask the mayor, and I understand that you will present the city's four-year financial plan.
I will. Well, Bob, thank you very much for doing this, and good afternoon, everyone. The subject of this meeting is the city's recently adopted budget and four-year financial plan, as Bob said. No question about it. I think the city faces significant budget challenges, both immediately and long-term. And today I thought I'd outline how we meet them in balancing this year's budget, how we met them in balancing this year's budget, and how we intend to address them from here on. The FCB was established 36 years ago at the height of the profound fiscal crisis that had gripped New York City. And by bringing much-needed rigor to the planning and management of New York City's finances, I think it's fair to say that the FCB helped right the city's fiscal ship. Thankfully, conditions today are far different from those that we faced back in 1975. Then the city's fiscal management left a lot to be desired, to put it mildly. Today, as the FCB report shows, the city's handling of its finances is thoroughly above reproach. Then the city's population was shrinking. In many communities, housing, public safety, public schools, and public health were all in decline. And all of these problems, as you remember, only worsened during and after the fiscal crisis as the city slashed basic services to balance its books. Today, on the other hand, the city's population is at an all-time high and still growing. And New Yorkers are living longer and healthier lives. Our average life expectancy today is 19 months longer than it was back in 2001. Fire deaths are at an all-time record low. Crime has fallen to levels last seen nearly a half-century ago. Our affordable housing initiative, the largest ever undertaken by any American city, is on course to meet its goals. And standardized test scores and graduation rates show our public school students progressing far faster than students in the rest of New York State. Back in 1975, even as the national economy was bouncing back from a recession, New York City's economy decidedly was not, if you remember. Today, however, the reverse is true. We came out of the last national recession sooner and stronger than the rest of the United States. As a matter of fact, from the bottom of this recession till now, the country has lost 6% of all private sector jobs. New York City has lost 0.5%. So 0.5% versus 6%. We must be doing something right. Nevertheless, we are facing significant challenges. The dire conditions that led us to and were accelerated by the fiscal crisis of the mid-1970s are rapidly fading memory for some and ancient history for others. Identified in the FCB report, they largely arrive from the matters beyond the city's direct control, and they include the need to curb rising pension costs that, unchecked, will ultimately overwhelm city government's ability to provide essential services. We are also threatened by the lethargic pace of the national economic recovery and the uncertainties caused by the debate on raising the nation's debt ceiling and reducing the federal deficit. Let me just point out that the pension burdens on New York City were $1.5 billion back in 2001, and for this coming fiscal year, the new one we're in, are $8.5 billion. In 10 years, they've gone from $1.5 to $8.5 billion, and it had very little, if anything, to do with the stock market, nor did it have very much to do with the increase in wages, which for most city agencies were less than the rate of inflation. This was all based on additional benefits voted by the state legislature and paid for by the city. Let me summarize where we stand today. As the FCB report stresses, the city's response to the deep financial recession was prudent, swift, and effective. We benefited from the multi-billion-dollar surpluses that we wisely accumulated during the pre-recession years, and those savings stood us in good stead when the national recession began and the city's tax revenues plummeted. Although those surplus funds, I might point out, are largely depleted, they have been crucial to our ability to weather the recession. We had put away $6 billion. We have used $4 of that $6 billion in the current fiscal year to balance our budget, leaving us only $2 billion surplus to be carried into next year and the year after. We were, for example, able to prepay expenses to the tune of $3.7 billion, I said, of those surplus funds. And even before the recession began, we directed city agencies across the board to begin tightening their belts. Since late 2007, these programs to eliminate the gaps, or as we call PEGs, have again and again produced substantial savings. And over the last 4 years, through 10 separate PEG programs, city agencies have taken $5.1 billion of gap-closing actions. Almost all of those are recurring actions. They're not one-time shots. Having said that, they are dwarfed by the $7 billion increase in pension costs. Cumulatively, they were instrumental, however, to balancing the budget for fiscal 2012, which began on July 1st. And let me point out that over the past 10 years, spending by all city agencies, with the exception of the Department of Education, has grown by 32%, while the rate of inflation during that time has been 33%. These city agencies are spending less money in real terms than back in 2002. And this exception in education, the reason is the exception is education, and the reason that we were underpaying teachers and losing them to other school districts was something that we had to meet. We could not continue the brain drain out of our city school system. So we made increasing teacher salaries a priority. Teachers, the Department of Education's budget has gone up by something like 105% over the last 10 years, with inflation up 33%. Now, let me be clear. The budget actions that we have taken will have real consequences, because the rest of the city's municipal workforce has refused to agree to additional savings. There will be layoffs of more than 1,000 non-uniform, non-pedagogical employees during the current fiscal year, and the only ways we'll be able to afford raises for city workers in the future is if we can find some savings in our pension and health care costs. As it is, we're going to have to find a few $1 billion in savings just to balance the budget without any raises. This is not a negotiating stance. This is just reality. Our best efforts notwithstanding, cutbacks in some city services, I think, also appear inescapable. But very importantly, the cooperation with Speaker Christine Quinn and her colleagues in the City Council will protect core services, including police and fire protection and the public schools. And we did that despite record-setting cutbacks in state support and by the impending expiration of federal stimulus funding. Our schools, if you remember, were hit hardest by these cutbacks. They experienced a nearly $2 billion reduction in state and federal aid. But rather than jeopardizing the progress that we had made in education, we chose instead to pick up the slack ourselves. To put all this in perspective, in 2002, the city provided 45% of funding for city schools. The state share was 44%, and the federal government provided the balance of 11%. That was back in 2002. City 45, state 44, federal government 11. In the current budget, on the other hand, the city's share of educational funding has grown to 56%, up from 45. The state's portion has shrunk from 44 to 36, and the federal funding is down to 8% of the total. I will say that this increased commitment by the city, along with the flexibility shown by Michael Mulgrew and the United Federation of Teachers, is what has helped us avert layoffs of classroom teachers for the coming school year. Having said that, let me add that meeting the costs of education will continue to be a major challenge going forward, and I don't think there's any scenario that says we will have as much money for education next year as we've had for last year. As the FCB staff report notes, it's critical for the city to realize savings now that can be applied to expenses in the budget for fiscal year 2013. And to accomplish that, we are, in part, seeking to reduce costs and improve efficiencies in the administration of all city agencies, which is a prime responsibility of the city's Deputy Mayor for Operations, Stephen Goldsmith. A year ago, he began leading efforts designed to realize $500 million in savings by the end of 2014, with recurring annual savings of $500 million after that in such areas as managing the city's real estate holdings, vehicle fleets, and information technology. Such reforms will, I think, also improve services as well as reduce expenses, and they're already producing results. For example, earlier this year, we began consolidating and modernizing the IT data centers of more than 40 city agencies, and we expect just this one example to produce some $100 million in savings and avoid expenses by the year 2014. Smart management that increases savings is welcome under any circumstances, but given the budget challenges we face, it's particularly urgent right now. We anticipate the budget gap of $4.6 billion for 2013 to grow to $4.9 billion by 2014. And closing such a large gap is going to require intense efforts over the next 12 months, and you can rest assured it will be a major priority for us. And even as we attempt to do more with less in delivering city services, we also have to face the fact that control of the principal drivers of this imbalance rests with the state. So closing these gaps requires actions by our partners in state government. First, on the revenue side, Albany just has to stop its indefensible and total denial of any revenue-sharing funds to one locality, and one locality alone in our state, and that locality is New York City. This is unfair on the face of it. 57 of the counties got cut 3%, we got cut 100%. Now, we recognize the state government's own budget difficulties, and we have commended many of the actions Governor Cuomo has taken to address them, and we're always prepared, as I've said repeatedly, to do our share. But there simply is no rationale for what occurred this year when other localities did suffer not at all, and we got allocated nothing. Zero. Zilch. When people wonder why we're facing service cutbacks, the cuts in state funding to our city are the primary reason. Because New York is the economic engine of the state, the consequences of these cutbacks are felt statewide. The pain inherent in our fiscal year 12 budget could have been significantly reduced by a more equitable sharing of these state revenues, the greatest portion of which, let me add, are generated in our city. A return to equitable treatment from the state will also help us balance our out-year budgets. State action is also needed on the expense side of the ledger, especially in reining in the city's skyrocketing pension and fringe benefit costs. During the fiscal year 2002, when I became mayor, I pointed out our burden was $7 billion less annually in pension benefits. This is an increase of over 500% from 2002. That is not a typo. 500% increase in our pension expenses from 2002 to the current fiscal year. Total pension costs now account for close to 13% of our current budget. To put 13% in perspective, that is greater than the operating budgets of the police, fire, corrections, and sanitation departments combined. Let me repeat that. Police, fire, corrections, and sanitation departments' combined operating budgets is less than the increase in our pension costs. This is clearly unsustainable. And that's precisely why we've long sought pension reforms of the kind that I'm happy to say Governor Cuomo proposed last month, and why we're glad he has included the city in his recently presented pension reform package. And while that would not affect the benefits for current retirees and city workers, those reforms, including the creation of a new pension tier for new city hires, would save New York City taxpayers $30 billion over the next 30 years. And I look forward to working with the governor to pass this bill when the legislature takes it up next year, and I'm encouraged to hear that this will be his top legislative priority. Before concluding, let me turn briefly to the subject on the debate of the national debt ceiling and deficit. At this point, I think it's uncertain what the outcome will be or what the effect on our economy and our budget will be. We do know that very substantial cuts to Medicare and Medicaid have been included in deficit reduction proposals that have been fashioned and floated in recent days, and that could severely affect one of our major industries, healthcare, which employs some 450,000 people in our city. There could, for example, be significant cutbacks at our teaching hospitals, which train some 5% of the nation's doctors. The city's public hospitals could also face substantial funding cuts. They may also be reducing federal funding in areas ranging from homeland security to affordable housing to social services. At this point, nothing specific is known, and the devil, as usual, is found in the details as they emerge. And I can assure you that we will continue to work with our 2 senators and our state's congressional delegation on both sides of the aisle to defend New York's interest in this process. But nothing that they will do, unless they make real reforms and really face the issues facing this country, is going to stop the belief around the world that America cannot be trusted and that it's constantly threatening our status as the reserve, or the dollar as the reserve currency. They are playing with fire, and this country and this world cannot afford that. I look forward to hearing the comments of others. Bob, thank you for giving us this time.
Mr. Mayor, thank you very much. I'd like to turn it over to Controller DiNapoli. Do you have any comments to
Yes, thank you, Bob, and thank you, Mayor Bloomberg, for your report. I'd like to offer some brief observations. The members of the board have a copy of our detailed analysis. I also want to acknowledge Ken Blyweiss, our State Deputy Controller for the City of New York, and his staff for the efforts of putting this analysis together. The nation's economic recovery has clearly hit a rough patch, but there are still reasons to be cautiously optimistic about the city's recovery. New York City's economy is recovering faster from the recession than first predicted, though it is obviously still feeling the after effects. So far, the city has regained about 79,000 jobs, or more than half of the jobs that were lost during the recession. Private sector job growth in New York City has been stronger than in the nation, and it is stronger at this point in the recovery than it was during the past 2 economic recoveries. Nevertheless, job growth is slowing, and the city's unemployment rate remains high, even though it has declined from a peak of about 10% to the current level of approximately 8.7%. Wall Street, the city's economic engine, got off to a very strong start in the first quarter of 2011, earning nearly half of the city's forecast for the entire year. Weaker second quarter results, however, have led to talk of renewed job losses as the securities and banking sectors continue to deal with the fallout from the financial crisis. Although New York City remains a top tourism draw and the commercial real estate market is improving, the residential real estate market lags. The faster than expected economic recovery, in combination with a drawdown in reserves, helped the city generate a surplus of $3.7 billion in 2011. While the surplus made the job of balancing the 2012 budget easier, difficult decisions still had to be made. I would note Mayor Bloomberg and City Council Speaker Quinn, with the cooperation of the United Federation of Teachers, prevented 4,100 teacher layoffs. Even with these layoffs rescinded, however, the city will employ 2,500 fewer teachers during the new school year compared with last year, which will lead to further increases in class sizes. The budget also restores funding to prevent the closure of 20 fire companies and other planned budget cuts, but the funding is in place for only 1 year. Notwithstanding the restorations, the 2012 budget still includes 1,000 layoffs and significant budget cuts. Over the past 4 years, the city has cut planned spending by $5 billion annually and cut staffing by a total of 14,900 employees. While this has been a difficult time for New York City, it has managed its budget in a fiscally prudent manner. The city, though, clearly is not out of the woods. While the 2012 budget is balanced, it includes more than $5 billion in non-recurring resources, such as the 2011 surplus and a drawdown from the Retiree Health Benefits Trust. So far, the city has drawn down a total of $1.1 billion from the trust, which was established not to balance the budget, but to fund post-retirement benefits other than pensions. These non-recurring resources will have to be replaced in subsequent years. In addition, debt service and other non-discretionary costs are projected to rise by more than 40% during the financial plan period. Consequently, the city's four-year financial plan projects budget gaps that average $4.8 billion during fiscal years 2013 through 2015. Although the city's financial plan includes few immediate risks, a number of issues require close monitoring. The pace of the economic recovery is clearly a concern. The national economy has slowed, and concerns are growing that the recovery could stall, which could affect New York City. As New York State and the federal government focus on balancing their budgets, the amount of financial assistance to New York City could be at risk. Current efforts to reduce the size of the federal deficit will surely lead to cuts in funding to states and localities, which could hit New York City hard. Failure to raise the federal debt ceiling would have serious implications for the nation, which could extend to New York City. Coming out of the recession, New York City is in a much stronger position than most states and other large municipalities. Nevertheless, the city projects a $4.6 billion budget gap for next year, and the city has yet to reach new labor agreements with its workforce. While the city still has substantial reserves, closing the structural budget gap in the absence of a stronger recovery or relief from federal and state mandates will be challenging. In closing, I'd like to congratulate Mayor Bloomberg, the City Council, and our City Controller, John Liu, on a job well done, strong fiscal stewardship during a very difficult time.
Thanks, Controller DiNapoli. I would like to see if City Controller Liu has any comments.
Thank you very much, Bob, and I am delighted once again to join in this meeting of the Financial Control Board. Let me first thank the members of this board, the public, and my colleagues in government for the opportunity to report on the city's finances as it relates to our fiscal 2012 budget. Let me acknowledge that I'm proud to be joined by our Deputy Controller for Accounting and Budget, Simcha Felder, and also our Assistant Controller for Budget, Ari Hoffman, who is here with us as well. Let me commend our governor and our state elected officials for balancing this year's state budget. Although we may not agree on some of the actions taken thus far, especially those that cut funds disparately for the city, we are currently in a much better fiscal situation than we were at last year's FCB meeting. As we have heard from my colleagues, Mayor Bloomberg has put forth a balanced city budget, and to do so, he and the City Council had to make some tough choices. But at the same time, they were able to avert some of the most drastic cuts proposed. These cuts were able to be mitigated in large part because of an additional $521 million in fiscal year 2012 budget surplus that materialized between the issuance of the executive budget and the adoption of the fiscal 12 budget. More than half of this additional funding is the result of increased tax revenues in fiscal 11. This new additional tax revenue, coupled with expenditure reductions and a shift of DOE funds, allowed for the restoration of the cuts proposed to the city classrooms and firehouses. The additional surplus was the result of additional revenues of $306 million and expense reductions of $215 million, which increased available revenues for prepayments by $521 million. The largest single risk to the mayor's budget and his reliance on a collective bargaining strategy that has yet to materialize into an agreement, the plan enacted does assume that the UFT and the CSA will forego wage increases or agree to other actions that would offset the cost of any wage increases. Based on precedents set in wage settlements with the other municipal unions during the corresponding round of negotiations, my office assumes that this action poses a risk of nearly $1.7 billion for fiscal 12. As we have seen in the past, the city is once again underestimating its overtime expenses. This year alone, we anticipate that the city will spend more on overtime than the mayor's office does, to the tune of $210 million. My office also feels that in the coming fiscal year, the city will collect about $118 million less in taxes due to lower than expected business-related collections. While real estate taxes will be stronger this year, we anticipate that the out years will continue the trend. Since commercial property values have rebounded, it is our expectation that investors will seek to rebalance real estate portfolios, resulting in increased transactions and more tax revenues. When all the risks and offsets are tallied, my office estimates the total risk to the fiscal 12 budget to be about $1.9 billion, the vast majority of it coming from the collective bargaining assumptions in the adopted budget. Since taking office, it has been my goal to assemble the most qualified, capable, and sought-after talent to help manage the assets of the city's pension funds. Over the past 18 months or so, we have hired new staff in our Bureau of Asset Management, worked with the boards of trustees, including those representing Mayor Bloomberg, to make available more data and more information about the pension systems than ever before, and are now in the process of finalizing asset allocation reviews, the first in 5 years, for each of the 5 boards in order to help continue our upward trend. By putting forth an investment strategy that capitalizes during upswings and is diversified enough to guard against downturns, we will be able to better position our assets. As you may have heard, the funds produced returns in excess of 20% this past fiscal year, the first time in 13 years they have done so, and these gains are on top of the 14% returns earned in the previous fiscal years. These 2 years will certainly help to mitigate future increases in pension costs. While pension costs has risen sharply over the past decade, it does seem that the trend is abating. For example, if you review the projections, the budget projections for fiscal 12 through fiscal 15, the financial plan shows that pension cost is projected to increase 3.2% over the period. Compare this to the total expenditure increase of 13.7% during the same period, and it is evident that pension cost as a percentage of total expenditures for the city is not necessarily on a steep rise. In closing, let me thank all those in attendance for your participation in the process. I would like to stress that we'll continue to aggressively seek to root out waste and find savings in our city government. We've had many discussions with Mayor Bloomberg and his deputies in that regard, whether it is through contract review, auditing, or bond refinancing. This New York City Comptroller's Office will continue to fulfill our duties to the New York City taxpayer. We have a responsibility as fiscal monitors to ensure that every penny is spent wisely, and given the looming budget gaps facing our city, this duty is more important than ever before. My report on the fiscal 2012 adopted budget is available here as well as on our website, not as fancy looking as Comptroller DiNapoli's. He's got one page of color print. Yours is all in black and white. But nonetheless, I'm not, I have no comment about that one. But nonetheless, the report is available, and once again, it's my pleasure to join Mayor Bloomberg, Comptroller DiNapoli, Director Mania, and all of our Financial Control Board members at this very important meeting. Thank you.
Thanks, Comptroller Liu. And now I'd like to ask Jeff Summer, our Executive Director, to present some evidence and maybe ask him if he has any color in his presentation.
I never print in color.
Very good.
Under orders by both budget directors. The Control Board staff issued its report on the city's financial plan on July 21st, and I would like to review the findings of the report. The city has adopted a balanced budget of $65.9 billion for fiscal 2012. At budget adoption, the city was able to identify, through increased business tax revenue and tax audits, and some decreased expenditures, an additional $521 million in resources in fiscal 2011. This allowed the city to increase the fiscal 2011 surplus to $3.7 billion, with the entire amount being used to help balance 2012. These actions and some additional actions to be taken in fiscal 2012 allowed the city to restore some of the most contentious expenditure reductions proposed in the executive budget, such as teacher layoffs and the elimination of fire companies. The city projects higher expenses in fiscal 2012 for most budgetary areas. The city expects a return to the high historical levels in Medicaid after the phase-out of federal stimulus money. growth in pensions and fringe benefits, including health care costs, as well as the escalating cost of debt service, which is a function of higher borrowing to support the capital program, and the assumption that interest rates will rise, continue to drive the increase in expenditures. On a positive note, city fund revenues increases by $1.9 billion in fiscal 2012 because of stronger tax collections and miscellaneous revenues. The local economic recovery is lifting the city's non-property taxes, which are in the second year of a broad-based collections upturn. However, this growth is insufficient to cancel out the fiscal stresses resulting from the depth of the recession and 3 years of revenue declines or stagnant growth for non-property taxes. Without the availability of surplus budget resources beyond fiscal 2012, the city's financial plan contains budget gaps of $4.6 billion for fiscal 2013, growing to $4.8 billion in 2014 and $4.9 billion by 2015, as the growth in revenues lags that of expenditures. The nation's lethargic job growth is providing very little support to the local economic recovery. Fiscal stresses and cutbacks of federal aid are forcing government entities to shed jobs, weakening total job growth for both the nation and the city. The city's plan calls for tax collections growth to weaken in 2013 and 14 in response to the sluggishness of the economic recovery and a likely slowdown in the financial sector. The slow revenue growth in those years has made it difficult for the city to close the large budget gaps that are in its financial plan. Similarly, the fast pace at which expenditures are growing relative to revenues has contributed to the budget imbalance. The expenditure area with the fastest growth over the 4-year period is debt service costs. While the city actively manages these costs, even with a new 10-year strategy that streamlines capital projects, debt service costs are projected to grow at a rapid pace. As in the past, in addition to debt service, growth in Medicaid, pensions, health care, and other fringe benefits continue to drive the out-year budget gaps. Hopefully, action will be taken in the next legislative session on the governor's proposals for a new pension tier for new employees in order to start to control the growth of pension costs. The task for the city will be to manage the fiscal 2012 budget in a way to start to build a surplus close to that achieved in fiscal 2011 that can deal with the projected $4.6 billion gap in fiscal 2013. With the uncertainty in the economy and the likelihood of further federal and state aid reductions, the city's ability to avoid contentious expenditure reductions will be tested. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Jeff. Now I'd like to open it to the private members to have any comments.
Thank you. I'll speak on behalf of the private members. At the past 3 Financial Control Board meetings, the private members have unanimously urged the city to address the long-term problem caused by unfunded retiree health benefits. While city officials have heard our concerns, the problem has not been addressed. The unfunded liability has grown to $80 billion, up from $63 billion just 3 years ago. And this hole is continuing to grow at about $5 billion per year. This is a huge liability. At $80 billion, the city owes almost 1/3 more for unfunded retiree health benefits than it owes for all of the city's general obligation and transitional finance authority debt combined. Against this liability, the city currently has set aside only $2 billion to the Retiree Health Benefit Trust Fund. Not $2 billion per year, $2 billion in total. Less than 6 months' worth of the annual increase in the unfunded liability. In fact, the amount set aside has been reduced by $1.1 billion in recent years, not increased, and used to fund city expenditures. To put this amount in perspective another way, the unfunded health liability equals about $10,000 for every resident of the city, and it's going up by about $600 per resident per year. Let me repeat that. The city has a bigger unfunded health care liability to its current and retired employees for services already rendered than it has outstanding general obligation and TFA debt. The unfunded amount is growing $5 billion per year, and the city has been taking money out of the Retiree Health Benefit Trust Fund rather than adding to it. If we can't make a dent in this liability now, when it's only $80 billion, how do we expect to meet our ballooning liabilities in the future? The city keeps its books in accordance with municipal accounting standards, and those standards do not yet require the recognition of the growth in the healthcare liability as an expense. However, the growth in liability is real even if unpaid for a period of time and reflects work already performed by city employees, not work to be performed in the future. The most basic concept of accounting should require a matching of the city's recorded expense with the workload and cost of the labor force. And the way to do this is to fund the health trust at least an amount sufficient that the net liability not grow. While the city did balance its 2011 budget according to generally accepted accounting principles, it would have had a deficit of about $4.8 billion if this increased retiree health liability had been funded. The recently approved budget for 2012 would have a deficit of almost $5 billion if the projected increase in unfunded OPEB liability were required to be included. These are enormous numbers. While we understand that your focus needs to include the current budget problems the city faces, we believe that the city's fiscal problems cannot be solved unless these unsustainable non-budget unfunded liabilities are also addressed. If we continue to ignore the growing costs of these unfunded post-retirement benefits, then in the future the city will either need to cut city services further or actually not be able to pay for the promises made to the city's employees. The city should make additional substantial contributions every year to the Retiree Health Benefit Trust Fund. In the absence of that, the city needs to reduce the unfunded liability through other means. Both management and labor need to acknowledge this. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Mayor, do you have any response?
I appreciate everybody's concern. The unfunded liabilities in our pension system as well as our healthcare system for retirees is of great concern. At the moment, accounting rules do not require you to fund that liability, but at least disclose it, and we do that. I think it's pretty clear that given the state constitution that prohibits us from taking away any benefits that the state legislature has voted, the likelihood of saving from current expenses is zero. The best you could hope for would be something down the road, a Tier 5 in our case, or 6 in the case I think it is for the state. I was pleased to see the governor recognizes this and says that he will do something about it. But keep in mind that we do live in a democracy, and the public has a lot of say in our budget. The city council, our legislative body, has a lot of say. They technically have to vote the budget. The mayor could veto that, but then they could pass a budget of their own. And I think we have come up with a responsible balance between providing the services that the city needs so that we don't walk away from our future, at the same time keeping down to the extent humanly possible the tax burden of the people who live here and the businesses that live here. I have continuously rejected raising taxes. At the same time, I have been adamant that we do not cut the services that the public absolutely has to have. We have to be able to walk our streets safely. We have to be able to make sure that there is a response in an emergency, whether it be from police, fire, ambulance. We have to educate our kids. We have to pay our municipal workforce competitively, or they will leave us. And I think, unfortunately, as you see happen again and again, some people, when they retire at early ages, leaving us with a big burden. And many of them move outside of New York when they retire because the taxes here are higher than they are in other states. From a competitive point of view, we really are, on one hand, constrained in the revenue side, on the other hand, constrained on the expense side. And the only ways out of this is to continue to do what I think we have been doing for the last decade, and that is improving the quality of life here so that businesses come here, people move here, people come to visit, and when the economy nationwide improves, we certainly should be leading the ways, and that will, I hope, give us the extra revenue we need to meet the obligations that we have in things like the unfunded health care benefits for retirees, or in the infrastructure that we need in this city to make sure that our bridges are safe, that the water supply is safe, that the kids have schools to go to with the right facilities, and all the other things that the city has been very responsible in investing in. If you take a look at other localities, their bridges are falling down. They have not invested in the kinds of technologies that will keep us safe that New York City has. And I'm very proud of the courage and the generosity of the public in New York City, who understands we cannot go back to the 1970s. We have to build and we have to invest, and we will continue to do that.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm going to jump ahead then and ask Jeff Summers to report on the staff's findings regarding fiscal year 2011 and their recommendation concerning the proposed resolution.
Thank you. The board reviews the 5 conditions that were in the original legislation that would have required the reimposition of a control period, and they review it each year to determine if any of them have occurred and whether or not there is a need to recommend the reimposition of a control period. I'd like to go through those conditions. The city shall have incurred a deficit in excess of $100 million in the results of operations. The city has entered fiscal 2011 subject to final audit with a surplus of $3.7 billion in its prepaid fiscal 2012 expenses. Condition 2, 3, and 4 are: the city shall have failed to pay principal or interest on any of its notes or bonds when due and payable. Number 3 is the city shall have issued notes in violation of restrictions on short-term borrowing set forth in Section 9B of the Act. And 4 is the controllers shall have jointly certified that they could not, on the basis of facts existing at the time of such certification, make the joint certification required to terminate a control period. In simple, non-legal language, the 2 controllers certify that there is sufficient market access for the city to issue its notes and bonds. The city has paid all principal and interest on its notes and bonds and has not violated any of the short-term borrowing provisions of the FEA. I have also received letters from the state and city controllers informing me that they do not see any likelihood that they would have reason to issue a joint certification relating to market access. Condition 5 is the city shall have violated any provisions of the Act, and such violation substantially impairs the ability of the city to pay principal or interest on its bonds or notes when due and payable, or the city's ability to adopt or adhere to a balanced operating budget. The city has not violated any provisions of the Act. The staff therefore recommends that the board approve a resolution determining that as of July 21st, 2011, none of the events which would have required the imposition of a control period has occurred, nor is there a substantial likelihood and imminence of such occurrence, and that the city has not experienced fiscal stress that would jeopardize the orderly function of the city's fiscal affairs.
Thank you, Jeff. Given Jeff's report, does anyone have any comments? If not, I would entertain a motion to approve the determination.
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor, say aye. Aye. Opposed, nay. In that case, that's the main source of business we have today. I'll now entertain a motion to adjourn the meeting. And second?
Second.
All those in favor say aye. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, every controller. Thank you. Thank you.